My name is Imogen Clarke. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I was the senior financial operations manager at a mid sized logistics firm just outside Manchester. Most people would describe me the same way: steady, composed, reliable. The kind of woman who color codes spreadsheets for comfort. The kind who remembers compliance deadlines without reminders. The one you call when something doesn't balance, because eventually I will find out why. What they wouldn't describe me as is threatening. I'm not loud. I don't interrupt. I don't perform well in meetings. I listen more than I speak. And when I do speak, I rarely raise my voice. Over the years, that calm became something people projected onto. Some mistook it for passivity, some for loyalty without limits. A few, I think, mistook it for naivety. This is the story of the year our CEO stood in front of 214 employees and announced the company's bankruptcy, and how, 3 days later, I released proof of the hidden executive bonuses. Before you assume this is a revenge story, it isn't. No one was screamed at, no glass shattered, no triumphant music played in the background while I exposed anything. What happened unfolded slowly, almost quietly. It was fewer explosions, more controlled detonations. The kind that happens when information meets timing. This is also not a story about heroism. I did not wake up brave. I did not storm into a boardroom demanding justice. For months, if I'm honest, years, I played the role I was given. I stayed late. I absorbed blame. I corrected errors that weren't mine. I watched decisions get made behind closed doors and told myself there were reasons I didn't understand until the numbers stopped making sense. What I want to share isn't just what happened inside the company. It's what happens internally when you realize you've been underestimated. When you understand that silence can be survival, but it can also be strategy. There's a difference between being invisible and observing unnoticed. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the only one who sees the full picture. Over the next hour, I'll tell you how small dismissals became patterns, how patterns became clarity, and how clarity became a decision I couldn't undo. Not out of anger, but out of alignment with my own moral code. Because when employees demanded answers after the bankruptcy announcement, when they started asking where the money really went, I already knew, and I had proof. But before we get there, I want to start with who I was to them. Because none of this makes sense without understanding the version of me they thought they were dealing with. Have you ever been so underestimated that people forgot you were paying attention? To them, I was infrastructure, not a strategy, not vision, infrastructure. I was the person who ensured supplier payments went out on time, the one who recalculated shipping margin discrepancies without being asked, the one who stayed after quarterly meetings to clean up whatever financial fog the executives left behind. In meetings, I sat 2 seats down from the CFO, close enough to pass him figures when he forgot them, far enough that no one ever mistook me for decision-making authority. When clients visited, I wasn't introduced unless something went wrong. This is Imogen, they'd say. She handles the numbers. Handles. As if the numbers were something fragile that needed quiet hands. I learned early that being dependable makes you useful. And being useful makes you invisible in a very specific way. People assume you'll continue functioning regardless of circumstance. They don't think to question what you see. I wasn't resentful about it. At least not consciously. There's a strange safety in being underestimated. You're rarely targeted, rarely challenged, rarely perceived as competition. You're the calm one, the organized one, the one who keeps us afloat. The irony of that phrase still isn't lost on me. Our CEO, Daniel Mercer, was charismatic in the way men in tailored suits often are, polished, expansive with his language. He spoke in metaphors about weathering storms and steering ships through turbulent waters. The company loved that imagery. I focused on actual balance sheets. To Daniel, I was efficient. To the CFO, I was reliable. To department heads, I was responsive. To junior staff, I was approachable. But to none of them was I strategic. No one asked what patterns I noticed over time. No one asked why certain cost centers kept expanding despite budget freezes. No one asked why executive travel expenses rose in quarters where operational budgets were supposedly tightening. Because that wasn't my lane. My lane was accuracy, and accuracy in corporate culture is rarely glamorous. There were moments when I felt the ceiling press down gently, not crushing, just firm, like a hand resting on your head, keeping you in place without ever applying enough pressure to justify a complaint. You're so steady, Imogen, Daniel once said after I corrected a forecasting model he'd misrepresented in a presentation. We'd be lost without you. It was meant as praise, but it positioned me exactly where they needed me, underneath. I don't think anyone intentionally minimized me. That's the uncomfortable truth. There was no villain monologue, no conscious conspiracy to sideline my voice. It was subtler than that. It was an assumption that I preferred background work, assumption that I wasn't interested in leadership, assumption that if I had concerns, I would raise them loudly. And because I didn't, they concluded I didn't have any. What they never accounted for was this: I was always paying attention. Every reimbursement request, every delayed vendor payment, every executive's retention incentive is quietly categorized as a restructuring expense. I saw everything, not because I was suspicious, because it was my job to reconcile discrepancies. At the time, I believed my role was to ensure stability, to maintain order, to trust that decisions above my clearance level were guided by information I didn't possess. I told myself that perspective matters, that leadership carries burdens I couldn't see, that loyalty means assuming good intent. That was who I was to them: stable, quiet, precise, safe. And safety, as I would eventually learn, is often mistaken for harmlessness. The first time something felt off, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or obvious corruption. It came in the form of a small reclassification entry, barely noticeable unless you were the one reconciling every line. It was late February, end of fiscal quarter one. We had just implemented what leadership called a temporary cost containment initiative. In simpler terms, department budgets were frozen, overtime was restricted, travel required CFO approval, hiring paused. The announcement had been framed as proactive, strategic, and responsible. 3 days later, I was reconciling executive compensation accruals when I noticed a one-time adjustment categorized under leadership retention stabilization. £187,500, split between 3 senior executives, not listed as bonuses, not listed as performance incentives. It was coded as a restructuring expense. I remember staring at the entry longer than necessary, not because the amount was extraordinary for executives, but because of timing. We had just denied a warehouse supervisor's request for two additional part time staff. It would have cost roughly £42,000 annually. The justification given: uncertain quarter ahead. I opened the internal memo attached to the executive payment. It was signed by Daniel and the CFO. It referenced market volatility and the need to secure leadership continuity. The language was careful, legal, sanitized. I didn't feel anger. I felt a small shift in temperature. When I asked the CFO, Martin, about the categorization, I kept my tone neutral. Just clarifying for reporting consistency, I said. Should these be disclosed in the quarterly compensation summary? He didn't look up from his monitor. No need, he replied. They're retention adjustments, not bonuses. Different classification. Different classification. Same money. I nodded, entered the adjustment, closed the ledger. No confrontation. No pushback. But that was the first small cut. Not because executives receive money. Companies do that. Markets are competitive. Retention packages exist. It was the contrast. We were communicating scarcity downward and distributing security upward, and everyone else accepted it without question. When the warehouse supervisor's staffing request was formally declined, HR cited budget preservation. The team absorbed additional workload. Overtime hours quietly increased despite restrictions. Morale dipped in small, unmeasured ways. I attended the quarterly town hall 2 weeks later. Daniel stood on stage, speaking about resilience. We're tightening our belts now, he said, so we can emerge stronger. The applause was polite. I scanned the room and wondered how many belts were actually tightening. That evening, I opened my black ledger. Not the official system, but my personal reconciliation notebook. I wrote a single line: retention adjustment. Q1, £187,500. Timing misaligned with austerity narrative. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I told myself there were layers I didn't understand. Perhaps investor pressure. Perhaps private equity requirements. Perhaps strategic reasons beyond operational visibility. I rationalized it because that's what loyal employees do. We assume context before we assume misconduct. But something subtle had changed. Before that entry, I processed numbers. After that entry, I started tracking patterns, not obsessively. Not yet. Just enough to see if this was isolated. It wasn't. And the most unsettling part? No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't have access to the data to connect it. That was the moment I understood something quietly powerful. Information asymmetry doesn't just protect leadership, it protects narratives. And I was sitting at the intersection of both. Still calm, still compliant, still steady, Imogen. But now, watching with a slightly different lens. A small cut doesn't bleed immediately. Sometimes it just makes you aware that skin can be broken. The second time it happened, it was easier to process, not because it hurt less, but because my mind had already begun adjusting to the possibility. By Q2, the language of temporary caution had evolved into strategic contraction. Travel freezes tightened. Department budgets were reduced by a flat percentage. Mid-level managers were instructed to identify efficiency redundancies. That phrase always unsettled me. Efficiency redundancies rarely affect executives. They affect coordinators, analysts, support staff. One afternoon, I was invited, last minute, to a budget review meeting with Daniel, Martin, and two board representatives dialing in remotely. My role was to walk them through operational spend compression, which meant explaining how much we had already cut. I prepared the slides. Detailed, clean, transparent. When I presented projected savings from departmental reductions, Daniel interrupted halfway through. Can we simplify this? He asked, glancing at the board members on screen. What's the headline? The headline, I replied evenly, is that we've reduced operational expenditure by 11.4% quarter over quarter. However, sustained reduction at this rate will impact service delivery timelines. He smiled in that polished way he had. So we're becoming leaner. That's the message. I didn't correct him. Technically, leaner was accurate. It just omitted the strain. Later in the meeting, one of the board members asked about leadership compensation adjustments in volatile periods. Martin answered before I could speak. Our executive team has shown admirable restraint, he said. Compensation remains aligned with long-term stability. Aligned. I watched the world settle into the minutes. I had the ledger. I had the entries. I had the Q1 retention adjustments and a smaller Q2 strategic incentive realignment allocation, already scheduled for processing. Aligned was technically defensible. It was also selectively framed. After the meeting, Daniel stopped by my desk. You're brilliant with the detail, Imogen, he said. Just remember, at this level, we need clarity over complexity. Clarity over complexity. It was framed as mentorship. But what I heard was, don't complicate the narrative. For a moment, just a flicker, I felt something sharper than before. Not anger. Not yet. Diminishment. My work was reduced to support material. My caution was reframed as overcomplication. My awareness subtly repositioned as tactical, not strategic. I could have pushed back. I could have asked in that room about executive incentives during contraction, but I didn't. And I've replayed that silence many times. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my place. That governance structures exist for a reason. That my responsibility was accuracy, not interrogation. That staying quiet preserved professionalism. It's astonishing how easily we normalize small dismissals when they arrive packaged as guidance. You're so dependable. You're invaluable behind the scenes. We need your precision behind the scenes. The phrase followed me. When departmental layoffs began, quietly at first, framed as natural attrition, I was asked to calculate severance exposure. I processed the number of people who had worked there for years. I ensured compliance with employment law. I did my job. And each time, executive expense reports continued to pass through my system. Strategy dinners, investor travel, advisory consultation fees, not illegal, not explosive, just disproportionate. I told myself I might be missing broader context. My proximity to operational strain made leadership decisions feel harsher than they were. I rationalized because that's what competent professionals do. We assume system integrity until proven otherwise. But slowly, something else began forming. A question I didn't voice. If we're all tightening belts, why do some belts seem custom tailored? The dismissals didn't escalate into cruelty. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, they accumulated like fine dust, barely visible unless you ran your finger across the surface. And I kept running my finger across the numbers, still calm, still precise, but no longer unquestioning. By mid-year, I understood the role I had been assigned, not formally. No one handed me a description, but roles in companies are rarely written in contracts. They're reinforced through repetition. I was the stabilizer, the quiet absorber of impact. When departments panicked over shrinking budgets, they came to me, not to leadership, for explanations. When managers couldn't reconcile revised forecasts with real-world strain, they asked me to make it work. When invoices were delayed because cash flow was being strategically managed, I was the one who fielded supplier frustration. Leadership announced direction. I implemented consequences. And because I did it without theatrics, without visible resentment, it became expected. There was a particular meeting that crystallized it. HR had proposed eliminating annual development stipends, £1,000 per employee, for courses or certifications. The justification: non essential expenditure during contraction. The total annual cost of that program was less than one executive offsite. I ran the numbers. The savings were marginal compared to the moral impact. I drafted a brief internal memo outlining both. When I presented it, Daniel listened, fingers steepled. "You always think about the ripple effects," he said. It sounded like admiration. Then he added, "But right now, we need to demonstrate discipline. Development can resume when we stabilize." Stabilize. The word again. The board approved the cut. Afterward, Martin turned to me privately. "Don't internalize it," he said. "These are macro decisions, micro consequences." Over time, I noticed a pattern in how I was included in conversations. I was invited when numbers needed validation. I was excluded when the strategy involved optics. In one leadership briefing, I overheard Daniel say, "Let's keep this tight, just executive level." I was two doors down, reconciling the compensation accruals he would reference in that meeting. Reliable, useful, invisible. It wasn't malicious. That's important to say. No one mocked me. No one belittled me overtly. But invisibility doesn't require cruelty. It requires predictability. And I was predictable. I stayed late without complaint. I delivered clarity under pressure. I corrected errors quietly rather than exposing them publicly. I protected the company's compliance posture even when leadership's narratives stretched thin. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. My professionalism was protecting decisions I didn't fully believe in, not because they were illegal, because they were misaligned. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, I sat at my desk reviewing executive expense summaries. Travel to Zurich, private advisory consultation in London, retention adjustment scheduled for Q3. In the warehouse that same week, shift rotations had been reduced to cut overtime. I opened my black ledger again. This time, I didn't just write the numbers. I wrote a question beneath them. If collapse comes, who absorbs it? I wasn't thinking about exposure yet. I was thinking about fairness. The role I had been assigned, stabilizer, translator, absorber, was sustainable only as long as I believed the structure deserved protection. And for the first time, I wasn't certain. Still, I said nothing, because silence had always kept things orderly, because speaking prematurely can fracture trust, because perhaps I was overinterpreting patterns that had reasonable explanations. That's the danger of being reasonable. You can rationalize almost anything, but somewhere beneath the spreadsheets and policy memos, something within me was recalibrating. Not loudly, not definitely, just quietly refusing to remain unquestioning. And that quiet refusal would matter later. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no dramatic discovery. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the warehouse corridor. I was there because payroll discrepancies had surfaced after reduced shift allocations. A forklift operator named Callum, early 30s, two children, had flagged that his overtime hours had been retroactively adjusted downward due to budget alignment. It amounted to just under £600. To the company, negligible. To him, school fees. He wasn't angry when he spoke to me. That's what stayed with me. He was embarrassed. "I just need to understand," he said, holding the printed payslip carefully, as if it were fragile. I was approved for those hours. He wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't threatening escalation. He was asking for clarity. Clarity. I reviewed the internal notes later. The overtime approvals had been valid when granted. But during Q2 compression, finance was instructed to reconcile overages where possible. It was framed as an adjustment, not a reversal. When I raised it with Martin, he gave me a measured look. We can't set a precedent by allowing uncontrolled overtime to stand, he said. Small leaks sink ships. Small leaks. I nodded, because technically, he wasn't wrong. Policy had been tightened. The system had flagged an excess. But that afternoon, as I walked back past the warehouse floor, I saw Callum explaining to his supervisor that he'd need to swap shifts to compensate, and something inside me recalibrated. It wasn't outrage, it was proportionality. 600 pounds scrutinized and reversed. 187,500 pounds categorized as stabilization. In that moment, the narrative of shared sacrifice fractured, not in public, inside me. Later that same week, Daniel circulated an internal video message about collective resilience. He spoke warmly about community, about navigating turbulence together. I watched it alone in my office. He wasn't lying outright. Revenue had dipped. Market pressure was real. The contraction wasn't fictional. But the distribution of the burden was not equal. And I could see it in granular detail. That evening, I didn't open my ledger immediately. I sat in silence first. I asked myself a question I had avoided for months. If this trajectory continues, what does my silence support? The answer wasn't simple. Silence supports stability. Silence supports career longevity. Silence supports internal cohesion. But silence also supports imbalance. I had always believed professionalism meant restraint. That you correct internally, not externally. That loyalty means discretion. But loyalty to what? A title? A leadership team? Or the people whose livelihoods were directly affected by those leadership decisions? The shift wasn't a decision to act, it was a decision to observe differently. Until that week, I had been documenting discrepancies as anomalies. After that week, I began documenting them as patterns. I created a separate encrypted archive, not company property, not accessible through shared drives. Every executive adjustment, every incentive is categorized under restructuring. Every retention package approved during the contract. Every severance calculation from operational staff. Not because I intended exposure, because I needed clarity. Data has a way of telling stories when you step back far enough. And the emerging story was not about market volatility alone. It was about insulation. Leadership was insulating itself from the full force of contraction. The realization didn't make me furious. It made me calm in a different way, clearer. There's a moment when you stop hoping a pattern will correct itself and you begin preparing for the possibility that it won't. That Tuesday in the warehouse corridor, holding a 600-pound discrepancy in my hands, I understood something quietly irreversible. If collapse ever came, the explanation would not match the truth. And if that day arrived, I would already have the records. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive, professional, habitual. Now, it was deliberate. There's a difference. When you're silent by default, you assume others are acting in good faith. When you're silent by choice, you're observing variables before you intervene. I didn't become colder. If anything, I became more composed. I attended meetings with the same measured tone. I delivered financial summaries with the same precision. I responded to emails promptly. Nothing outward shifted. That was important. In Q3, a new cost initiative rolled out: vendor payment extensions. Standard practice during contraction is framed as cash flow optimization. Payment terms shifted from 30 days to 60 days for select suppliers. It improved liquidity on paper. It strained relationships quietly. I watched as smaller vendors began emailing accounts payable with careful wording, just checking in, confirming revised timeline, hoping for clarity. The numbers told me what their emails didn't. We were using their margins to protect ours. Meanwhile, executive compensation accruals remained uninterrupted. A Q3 performance alignment payment cleared, smaller than Q1's retention adjustment, but still substantial. Again, categorized cleanly. Again, defensible. Silence in this phase felt strategic. I asked more questions, but always framed as compliance verification. Should we document board approval for this adjustment? Would you prefer this coded under restructuring or leadership stabilization? Is this payment subject to disclosure in the annual summary? Each question positioned me as diligent. None positioned me as suspicious. Martin grew accustomed to my thoroughness. Daniel continued to praise my steadiness. "You're unshakable, Imogen," he once said during a particularly tense forecast review. "I wish more people had your temperament." I smiled. Unshakable. He meant compliant. But what he didn't realize was that I was no longer absorbing narrative without analysis. I began mapping timelines, revenue dips aligned with investor briefings aligned with compensation adjustments. Operational cuts preceded executive incentives by weeks. Correlation isn't always causation, but patterns repeat for reasons. The more I documented, the calmer I felt. That surprised me. You'd expect growing tension, anxiety, moral agitation. Instead, I felt steadier than ever because clarity removes confusion. I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. I wasn't rationalizing either. I was preparing for outcomes. In staff corridors, conversations grew heavier. Rumors circulated about potential restructuring beyond natural attrition. People speculated quietly, trying to read between leadership's polished statements. No one had access to what I had. They sensed instability. I saw insulation. And here's what they never noticed about me during this period: I stopped defending leadership reflexively. When managers vented about budget contradictions, I didn't counter with, "There must be context." I listened. When staff questioned executive travel during contraction, I didn't reassure them with corporate language. I remained neutral. Neutrality can feel like passivity to observers, but internally, neutrality was alignment with truth. I wasn't ready to act, not because I was afraid, because timing matters. If exposure comes too early, it's dismissed as a grievance. If it comes without documentation, it's framed as a misunderstanding. If it comes without consequence, it's absorbed and neutralized. So I waited, and I collected every policy update, every compensation memo, every restructuring narrative. Silence became less about avoiding conflict and more about protecting leverage, not for revenge, for accountability, if it ever became necessary. And beneath it all, one question remained quietly anchored in me. If the company falls, will the story told to employees match the financial reality? I had a growing suspicion, and suspicion, when supported by documentation, becomes something much more powerful. It becomes proof. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like diligence. It looks like someone is doing their job slightly more carefully than necessary. That was the phase no one noticed. By the fourth quarter, revenue pressure had intensified. Investor communications became more frequent. Forecast models were revised twice in 1 month. an unusual occurrence for a company of our size. Publicly, leadership maintained composure. Internally, language shifted subtly from contraction to restructuring readiness. That phrase stayed with me. Restructuring readiness doesn't appear overnight. It implies forethought, which meant someone knew where this trajectory was heading before employees did. I began reconciling not just transactions, but timing architecture. I created a private matrix in my encrypted archive. Date of operational cut announcements, date of executive compensation adjustments, cash flow status at time of adjustment, investor communication timing, vendor payment extension phases, severance allocations, side by side, quarter by quarter. Individually, each entry was defensible. Collectively, the story shifted. In Q1, retention bonuses preceded cost freezes by days. In Q2, executive incentive alignment occurred before development stipends were cut. In Q3, performance accruals were processed during vendor payment extensions. In Q4, preliminary insolvency modeling began, while executive compensation remained protected. The modeling was what changed everything. It was subtle, buried in scenario planning documents. I had access because finance modeled risk exposure. There it was. Downside scenario forecasting potential insolvency thresholds. The earliest draft was dated 6 months before the bankruptcy announcement. 6 months, which meant leadership had modeled collapse while publicly reinforcing temporary contraction. That wasn't illegal. Companies scenario plan all the time. But what they didn't disclose was that executive compensation safeguards had been structured ahead of those risk models maturing. Retention payments, incentive protections, contractual exit bonuses triggered under insolvency conditions. I remember staring at the clause language one evening. In the event of insolvency or asset liquidation, executive compensation protections shall remain prioritized obligations under restructuring agreements. Prioritized. Below secured creditors, yes. But above the operational staff. I closed my laptop slowly. The air in my office felt different that night. This was no longer about imbalance during contraction. This was about insulation before the collapse. Still, I did nothing publicly. Instead, I researched insolvency law in the UK. Quietly, methodically. I consulted publicly available governance frameworks. I reviewed disclosure obligations, not to trap anyone, to understand thresholds. At what point does strategic narrative become misleading? At what point does omission become an ethical breach? I spoke to no one about it. That was important. Preparation loses power when announced prematurely. Meanwhile, internally, layoffs expanded. Entire support teams were consolidated. Travel budgets vanished entirely, except for board level meetings classified under governance necessity. Employees felt instability, but not inevitability. That's the difference leadership controlled. Timing of awareness. I attended a mid December executive forecast meeting. Daniel spoke carefully. We're not in crisis, he said. We're navigating volatility. I looked down at my printout of the insolvency scenario modeling dated June. Volatility had been modeled as terminal 6 months prior. What they never noticed during this period was that my questions became sharper, but still neutral. Should we update disclosure language to reflect scenario planning? Are retention agreements aligned with projected restructuring timelines? Have employee communications accounted for downside modeling? Each question was answered with reassurance. Yes, it's standard. No need to alarm staff. We're within governance norms. Perhaps we were, but norms don't always equal fairness. By January, liquidity projections narrowed dramatically. Cash reserves would not sustain operations beyond spring without external injection. I ran the numbers twice, then three times. The conclusion remained. Unless investors intervened or assets were sold, the company would declare insolvency within months. And yet, executive compensation triggers had already been secured. That's when preparation shifted into inevitability. Not because I intended exposure, because I knew one thing with certainty. When bankruptcy was announced, employees would be told it was sudden, unavoidable, a shock, and I would know it wasn't. I wasn't angry. I was clear. Clarity is quieter than rage, but far more enduring. And by then, my archive wasn't just documentation. It was timeline. It was context. It was an insulation against narrative distortion. I didn't know exactly what I would do with it yet, but I knew this. If the story told did not match the evidence I held, silence would no longer be alignment. It would be complicity. The bankruptcy announcement happened on a Thursday morning, 9 a.m. mandatory all-staff meeting. Calendar invite sent the night before with the subject line, Company Update. I knew before I walked into the auditorium. The cash flow forecast I finalized 2 days earlier had confirmed it. No bridge funding, no asset sale, no emergency capital injection. Terminal liquidity point, 12 weeks. Daniel stood on stage in a navy suit, no tie. A subtle signal of gravity. His voice was steady. After exhaustive efforts to stabilize operations, he began, "We have made the difficult decision to file for administration." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, just stunned. He spoke about market volatility, supply chain disruption, investor withdrawal, unpredictable macroeconomic conditions. Unpredictable. I watched faces in the rows ahead of me, warehouse supervisors, operations managers, junior analysts. Shock is a quiet thing at first. It looks like confusion before it becomes fear. Daniel assured staff that leadership had been working tirelessly to avoid this outcome, that the decision had come after recent developments made continuation impossible. Recent. I kept my expression neutral because I had seen the June insolvency modeling. I had seen the retention agreements structured months before. I had processed executive compensation triggers that activated under administration conditions. And as the meeting concluded, HR began distributing information about redundancy consultations. No mention of executive exit protections, no mention of compensation prioritization clauses, just market volatility. Afterward, clusters formed in corridors. People asked each other the same question in different wording. When did this start? No one had the answer, except I did. That afternoon, I returned to my office and closed the door. I opened my encrypted archive. For months, I had documented patterns without deciding whether they would ever leave my possession. I had told myself the archive was for clarity, for my own moral calibration. Now, clarity demanded direction. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm in a way that surprised even me, because the moment I had quietly prepared for had arrived. And it wasn't chaotic internally, it was structured. I cross referenced the bankruptcy filing timestamp with executive compensation triggers, already processed, retention agreements secured in Q1, incentive alignments in Q2, performance protections in 3, insolvency modeling in June, public announcement in February. The narrative gap was measurable. I reviewed employment law guidance again. Disclosure obligations, directors' duties under UK insolvency statutes. There's a fine line between strategic discretion and misleading omission. I wasn't interested in accusations. I was interested in transparency. Around 3:30 p.m., an email circulated from HR requesting employees refrain from speculation on internal financial decisions. Speculation. That word settled heavily. Speculation implies uncertainty, but I wasn't uncertain. By 5 p.m., my inbox contained messages from colleagues. Did you see this coming? Were the numbers really that bad? Was this sudden? I answered carefully. The modeling has been evolving for months. We've been under pressure longer than communicated. There were contingency scenarios. I chose neutral phrasing, but the questions kept coming, and beneath them, a shared realization was forming among staff. If the collapse had been foreseeable, why did no one prepare us? That evening, I printed a timeline summary from my archive. Not every document, not raw data dumps, a structured sequence. Date of first insolvency modeling, date of executive retention agreements, date of operational austerity measures, date of executive incentive protections, date of vendor payment extensions, date of bankruptcy filing. Clean, factual, chronological, no adjectives, no accusations, just alignment of timing. I stared at the printed pages on my desk. This was leverage, not emotional leverage, informational leverage. And it came with weight. If I released it internally, the narrative would fracture. Trust in leadership would collapse faster than the company already had. If I withheld it, employees would believe the collapse was sudden, unavoidable, and shared equally. Neither option felt comfortable, but one felt aligned with my moral code. Transparency over loyalty, truth over comfort, fairness over reputation. I didn't act that night. I slept on it. And in the morning, when employees began demanding answers in internal chat threads, asking where the money really went, I understood something with absolute clarity. The question had already been asked. All that remained was whether I would answer it. The decision wasn't made in anger. That's important. If I had acted from anger, I would have sent everything at once. Raw files, contracts, internal emails. It would have been reactive, emotional, easy to dismiss as retaliation from a finance manager caught in a collapse. Instead, I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with the printed timeline in front of me and asked a quieter question. What outcome am I actually seeking? Not punishment, not humiliation, not destruction. The company was already entering administration. Jobs were already at risk. Damage was unfolding regardless of my involvement. What remained within my control was narrative. How would this be remembered? There were three paths in front of me. Option 1, stay silent. Let the administration process unfold. Preserve professional relationships. Protect my own future employability. Allow leadership's version of events to stand. Option 2, escalate privately. Request a meeting with the board or administrators. Present the timeline internally. Advocate for more transparent employee communication without public exposure. Option 3, release the documentation to staff directly, cleanly, factually, without commentary, so they could draw their own conclusions. Each option carried consequences. Silence would protect me. Private escalation might be absorbed quietly. Administrators often prioritize asset recovery, not moral recalibration. Public internal release would fracture whatever remained of executive credibility. It would likely end my relationship with the leadership team permanently. I considered the legal landscape carefully. I had not stolen funds. I had not fabricated documents. The information in my archive consisted of financial records I had legitimate access to in my role. But context matters. Intent matters. I opened my laptop and drafted 3 versions of a potential communication. The first was confrontational. I deleted it. The second was defensive, overly cautious. I deleted that too. The third was simple, a structured email to all employees, attaching the timeline summary and citing publicly filed documents where applicable. No accusations, no adjectives, just dates, amounts, clauses. I added one sentence at the top for transparency and in light of questions regarding the timeline of events. I am sharing documented financial milestones relevant to the administration filing. That was it. Not exposing, not revealing wrongdoing. Sharing documented milestones. Before sending anything, I paused. I imagined the aftermath. Daniel is reading it. Martin is reading it. Employees are reading it. I imagined the ripple of realization. Some would feel vindicated. Some would feel betrayed. Some would feel angrier than before. But at least they would be informed. Then I imagined staying silent. Months later, former colleagues believing collapse had blindsided leadership as much as staff, believing sacrifice had been shared equally. That image felt heavier than potential backlash. There's a moment when your internal alignment outweighs external risk. I realized something then. This was no longer about the company. It was about my integrity. For months, I had told myself I was documenting patterns for clarity. Now, clarity demanded consistency. If my moral code prioritized transparency over loyalty, then loyalty without transparency was misalignment. I didn't need to humiliate anyone. I didn't need to dramatize. I just needed to remove ambiguity. So I refined the attachment one final time. Redacted sensitive personal data. Confirmed accuracy against filings. Then I scheduled the email for 8:30 a.m. before the next all-staff Q&A session. Not impulsive, not theatrical, timed. Because once information enters a room, it cannot be unseen. And once narrative fractures, it cannot be fully repaired. I closed my laptop. The decision was made, quietly, irreversibly. The email was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. But the real work happened before that. People imagine exposure as a single dramatic act. One click, one message, one irreversible send. In reality, it's preparation layered carefully to withstand scrutiny. The night before, I reviewed every line of the timeline again. Not for impact, for accuracy. Dates verified against board minutes. Compensation figures cross-checked with payroll records. Insolvency, modeling timestamp confirmed through document metadata. Executive retention clauses referenced exactly as written. No interpretation, just alignment. I removed anything that could be framed as confidential beyond relevance. No personal addresses, no private emails, only structural financial milestones that directly connected to the bankruptcy narrative. I wasn't trying to create a scandal. I was eliminating plausible deniability. At 7:45 a.m., I logged into the system early. The office was quiet. Administration consultants had already begun occupying one side of the building, reviewing assets, speaking in hushed tones about liabilities and recovery projections. The internal chat channels were restless. Employees were already asking questions ahead of the 9 a.m. Q&A. Was this really sudden? Why weren't we told earlier? What happened to the cost savings from last year? I didn't respond. At 8:28 a.m., I opened the scheduled email draft one last time. Subject line: Financial timeline. Administration context. Calm, neutral. I hovered over the scheduled send, not to cancel it, but to ensure I felt steady. And I did. Not angry, not shaking, just aligned. At 8:30 a.m., it went out. No dramatic notification, no sound effect, just a quiet line of text entering 214 inboxes. For exactly 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then the internal chat paused. Paused. It was the silence before comprehension. At 8:34 a.m., the first message appeared in the general channel. Is this accurate? At 8:35. These dates, June modeling, at 8:36. So retention bonuses were secured before insolvency projections? I did not respond publicly because the documents were attached. People were reading for themselves. By 8:40 a.m., The Q&A session that leadership had scheduled for 9 o'clock was already unraveling internally. Employees were screenshotting the timeline, cross-referencing with Daniel's statements from the bankruptcy announcement. Someone wrote, "They said recent developments. This modeling is from 6 months ago. No insults, no chaos, just questions, and questions are harder to silence than accusations." At 8:47 a.m., Martin called my direct line. I let it ring twice before answering. "Imogen," he said, voice measured but tight. "What exactly have you circulated?" "A factual timeline," I replied calmly. "All information already documented within finance records or public filings. You've created unnecessary disruption." "I've clarified chronology," I said. There was a pause. "You should have brought this to us," he added. I didn't respond immediately, because technically I had, months earlier, through questions that had been answered with reassurance. Instead, I said, "Employees are asking for context." The line went quiet. By 9 a.m., the Q&A session began under a different atmosphere, no longer shocked. Now scrutiny. Employees asked directly about June's insolvency modeling, about executive retention agreements, about compensation protections under administration. Daniel maintained composure. He referenced standard governance practices, strategic confidentiality, complex market variables, all true. But now, incomplete truths were visible, and that changes tone. I remained in the audience, silent, not defensive, not triumphant, just observant, because the shift wasn't explosive. It was structural. The narrative had fractured, not through accusation, but through alignment of dates. And once employees saw where the money really went, the questions no longer sounded emotional. They sounded informed, and informed questions are far more powerful than outrage. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as gravity. By midday, the building felt different. Not chaotic, not loud, just heavier. Employees moved in clusters now, speaking in lower tones, not about bankruptcy itself, but about timing, about retention clauses, about the June modeling. The emotional shift was subtle but decisive. Before the email, people were grieving something unpredictable. After the email, they were processing something foreseeable. That distinction matters. Grief invites sympathy. Foreseeability invites accountability. Daniel called an emergency leadership meeting at 11:30 a.m. I wasn't invited. For the first time in months, that exclusion felt intentional rather than habitual. At 12:15 p.m., HR sent a follow-up email reminding staff that financial governance decisions are complex and multi-layered. It urged professionalism and unity during administration proceedings. Unity. The word felt fragile now, not because unity was undesirable, but because unity without clarity had already fractured. In the afternoon, my inbox began filling steadily, not accusations, not praise. Questions. Was the insolvency modeling definitive back in June? Were the retention payments tied to potential collapse? Did the board know this early? I responded carefully to each message. I did not speculate. I referenced the documents attached. The June document is labeled as downside scenario modeling. The retention agreements were dated prior to Q2 austerity measures. The board minutes confirm awareness of volatility thresholds. Calm, factual, and something unexpected happened. The tone of employee communication shifted from despair to coherence. People weren't shouting, they were connecting dots. In the warehouse, I overheard someone say, "So they knew. They just didn't tell us." It wasn't rage, it was resignation mixed with clarity. Meanwhile, leadership felt something else: loss of narrative control. Around 3 p.m., Daniel requested to meet with me privately. His office blinds were partially drawn when I entered. He wasn't furious. That surprised me. He looked tired. You've put us in a difficult position, he said evenly. I've shared a timeline, I replied. You've implied misconduct. I haven't implied anything. The documents are factual. He studied me for a moment, as if recalibrating who I was. For years, I had been the steady operator, the one who corrected quietly, the one who deferred publicly. Now I was still steady, but no longer deferential. These kinds of strategic decisions aren't always suitable for broad interpretation, he said. Employees are directly affected, I answered. Interpretation was already happening. There was no shouting, no threats, just recognition. He realized in that room that I had not acted impulsively. I had acted deliberately, and deliberate action is harder to discredit. By evening, external whispers began. Someone had forwarded the timeline to a journalist contact. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. Administrators are sensitive to reputational risk. Within days, official communications from leadership shifted tone. Language became more precise. Earlier scenario planning replaced recent developments. Executive retention frameworks replaced silence. The truth wasn't fully confessed, but it was no longer entirely obscured. And that was the consequence. Not a scandal, not a public spectacle, structural correction. The leadership team could no longer frame the collapse as sudden. They had to acknowledge foresight. And foresight, once acknowledged, invites responsibility. As for me, I wasn't suspended. I wasn't escorted out. But something intangible had shifted permanently. I was no longer infrastructure. I was no longer invisible. And when invisibility dissolves, people see you differently, not as harmless, as intentional. The company was still collapsing. Jobs were still uncertain. But now, employees understood the chronology of their reality. And understanding, even in loss, restores a measure of dignity. Once a narrative fractures, you can't glue it back together with better wording. Leadership tried. Over the next week, official communications grew increasingly polished. A revised FAQ document was circulated addressing timeline misunderstandings. It emphasized that scenario modeling is standard practice. Executive retention agreements are common safeguards during volatility. Those decisions were made in good faith under evolving circumstances. All of it is technically defensible. But something fundamental had shifted. Employees weren't confused anymore. They were comparing dates, comparing language, comparing who had been protected and who had absorbed risk. The administrators, sensing tension, began hosting small group sessions. They spoke about asset recovery, buyer interest, and restructuring possibilities. Their focus was procedural, not moral. But the moral question lingered in hallways. If they knew in June, why did we cut development budgets in July? If insolvency was modeled, why secure executive incentives first? Why were we told this was sudden? Those weren't emotional reactions. They were timeline-based questions. And timeline-based questions are difficult to neutralize. Daniel attempted a more candid tone in a follow-up town hall. We were navigating uncertainty, he said. There were real efforts behind the scenes to secure funding. I didn't doubt that. There likely were. But funding efforts and compensation insulation had moved in parallel, not sequentially. And that parallel movement was now visible. In private, I learned that some board members were uncomfortable. Not with the financial decisions themselves, but with how communication had been handled. Documentation makes selective storytelling harder. Meanwhile, executive exit packages, triggered under administration, were quietly processed. That detail surfaced internally faster than leadership anticipated. Because once people begin asking precise questions, they request precise numbers. When confirmation came, that retention clauses would be honored during administration proceedings. The atmosphere changed from disappointment to finality. Not rage, finality. There's a specific kind of calm that follows realization. It's the calm of understanding that nothing will be reversed. Jobs would still be lost. Administration would still proceed. Executive contracts would still be honored. The difference was this: no one believed the collapse had been unforeseeable anymore, and that belief cannot be undone. I was called into a meeting with the administrators midweek. Two consultants, neutral expressions, legal pads open. Your communication accelerated internal awareness, one of them said. We need to ensure no confidential breaches occurred. I shared financial chronology already documented within company records. I replied. Nothing fabricated, nothing altered. They reviewed the attachment. After an hour of careful questioning, they concluded that while my action was unconventional, it did not constitute unlawful disclosure. Unconventional. That word lingered. In the days that followed, I noticed something subtle in how colleagues interacted with me. Not fear, respect, not loud gratitude, quiet acknowledgement. People stopped asking, "Did you see this coming?" and started saying, "Thank you for clarifying." I hadn't saved anyone's job. I hadn't stopped the administration, but I had removed illusion. Leadership, for its part, grew distant. Meetings happened without me. Strategic discussions no longer included my input. It didn't matter. The outcome was already in motion, and the truth, once released, could not be resealed. That's the thing about timing. If transparency comes before collapse, it can prevent damage. If it comes during a collapse, it clarifies responsibility. If it comes after a collapse, it feels vindictive. Mine had come at the edge, not early enough to change fate, but not late enough to be dismissed. By the end of that week, everyone understood one quiet reality. The story they had been told was incomplete, and no revision could make it whole again. The final confrontation wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a meeting request titled Transition Discussion. Daniel asked me to join him and Martin in the executive boardroom late Friday afternoon. The administrators had already begun asset evaluations on the lower floors. The building felt partially vacated, like a space already belonging to memory. When I entered, Daniel gestured for me to sit. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he said calmly, "You've altered the trajectory of how this will be remembered." It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. I shared a timeline, I replied. Martin leaned forward slightly. "You understood the implications." "Yes," I said. "I did." There it was. Not denial, not defensiveness, just acknowledgement. Daniel folded his hands. "We were trying to manage panic." "I know," I said. "And you believe we misled people." "I believe the chronology wasn't fully communicated." He studied me again, but differently this time. Not as infrastructure, as equal weight. "There are complexities you don't see at the board level," he said. "I'm sure there are," I answered. But the modeling existed. The retention agreements existed. Employees deserved awareness of that timing. The room remained steady. No escalation. Because this wasn't about legality. It was about the interpretation of duty. Martin spoke more quietly. "You could have come to us." "I did," I said gently. "For months. Through questions." That landed. Not harshly, just factually. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You realize your position here is complicated now." I assumed it would be. Another silence. Then something unexpected happened. He nodded, not in agreement, in recognition. "You've always been precise," he said. "I suppose we underestimated what that precision meant." There was no apology, but there was clarity. I wasn't escorted out. I wasn't reprimanded formally. Administrators would eventually restructure remaining roles, and mine, like many others, would dissolve in due course. But in that room, something equalized. not power, perspective. For years, I had been the stabilizer beneath strategy, the quiet executor of decisions made elsewhere. Now, I was the person who had forced alignment between internal knowledge and external communication. Without shouting, without spectacle, just documentation. As I stood to leave, Daniel added, "History is rarely kind in situations like this." I paused. "History is rarely accurate either," I replied, "unless someone documents it." I left the room without animosity. I didn't hate them. I didn't believe they were villains. I believed they made decisions that prioritized insulation over transparency. And when the insulation cracked, they preferred a controlled narrative. I preferred chronology. That was the difference. The confrontation didn't end with a resolution. It ended with mutual understanding that the version of me they once relied on, the invisible, endlessly absorptive operator, no longer existed. In her place stood someone just as calm, just as precise, but no longer silent when silence distorted reality. And that shift required no heat at all. Administration concluded 3 months later. The company was partially acquired. Some departments were absorbed into a competitor, others dissolved entirely. My role disappeared on paper before it disappeared in practice. I helped reconcile final ledgers, assisted administrators with asset tracing, and ensured compliance reports were accurate to the last decimal. Even in the end, I finished cleanly. When my exit meeting came, it was procedural, severance calculated, access revoked, laptop surrendered. No hostility, just closure. In the weeks after, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt lighter. For years, I had equated professionalism with endurance, with absorbing contradiction quietly, being the stabilizing presence, no matter how imbalanced the structure above me became. Now I understand something different. Professionalism without alignment becomes self erasure. The most significant shift wasn't external reputation, it was an internal calibration. For the first time in my career, I trusted my judgment without requiring external validation. I replayed the timeline often, not to question my decision, but to understand it fully. I hadn't acted to destroy anyone's career. I hadn't acted impulsively. I acted because the story being told did not match the documented reality. And when those two diverge long enough, silence becomes participation. Since then, I've moved into consulting, financial governance, and ethical risk assessment. Smaller firms, early stage companies, organizations that believe compliance isn't just about legality, but narrative integrity. When I sit in boardrooms now, I speak earlier, not louder, earlier. When scenario modeling begins, I ask about communication plans alongside contingency plans. When executive incentives are structured during contraction, I ask how proportionality will be explained to staff. Sometimes I met with discomfort. I no longer interpret that as a threat. Discomfort is often where alignment begins. Colleagues from the old company still message occasionally. Some found new roles quickly, others took longer. A few told me the timeline gave them clarity during a disorienting period. One wrote, "At least we weren't crazy. We felt it coming." That meant more to me than any public recognition could have. Because this was never about being right. It was about preventing quiet gaslighting. There's a particular harm in being told the collapse was sudden when you can sense erosion beneath your feet. Clarity restores dignity. As for Daniel and Martin, I don't harbor resentment. Leadership is complex. Pressure from investors, boards, markets. It narrows decision-making frameworks. But complexity does not excuse opacity. If anything, it requires greater transparency. Who am I now? Still calm, still analytical, Still, the woman who reconciles discrepancies. But I no longer accept invisibility as safety. I understand that quiet doesn't mean passive, it can mean prepared. And I've learned that dominance doesn't require volume, it requires timing. Most importantly, I no longer confuse loyalty with silence. Loyalty, when healthy, includes truth. And truth, delivered without heat, is often the most destabilizing force of all. When people hear this story, they sometimes ask if it was worth it. Worth the tension, worth the strained relationships, worth closing a door I could never reopen. I think that question depends on what you measure. If you measure success by preservation of comfort, then not staying silent would have been easier. If you measure success by preventing collapse, then no, I didn't stop the administration. But if you measure success by alignment, by whether your actions reflect your values when tested, then yes, it was worth it. The company didn't fall because of my email. It fell because of market pressure, structural decisions, and risk accumulation over time. What my email changed was something quieter. It ensured that when employees demanded answers about where the money really went, they weren't dismissed as emotional or uninformed. They had chronology, they had documentation, they had clarity. And clarity, even in loss, restores a measure of control. There's a common misconception that power is loud, that dominance looks like confrontation or spectacle. But sometimes, the most powerful act is simply refusing to let a distorted narrative stand unchallenged. No shouting, no humiliation, no revenge, just evidence. The truth doesn't need volume, it needs timing. Looking back, I don't see villains in tailored suits. I see leaders who prioritize insulation under pressure. I see myself choosing whether to protect that insulation or expose the imbalance beneath it. I chose exposure, not to destroy, but to align reality with the record. So I'll leave you with this. If you discovered that the story being told didn't match the facts you held in your hands, would you stay silent to preserve peace? Or would you speak calmly, precisely, and at the right moment? I'm curious how you see it, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one deciding how history will remember what happened.